As some of you may know, Rabbi Bess and I both went to rabbinical school together. That is, technically, it is not where we met, but it is where we got to know each other. It is also not where we became a couple, not by any means, but that's a story for another time. This story is about when we first began our stateside rabbinical education. We spent our first year in Jerusalem and then went to the States, and we both studied in the Los Angeles campus. Now, like most of our classmates, we had never really spent any time on the West Coast and had to learn that things are a little different over there. And the memory that stands out in my mind the most is going over to one of my classmates' apartments soon after our semester had started, and he showed me his recent exciting Amazon purchase. He had just bought and received an earthquake preparedness kit. I had never heard of such a thing. He was not from Los Angeles either, but upon getting there, that is what he felt he should purchase. So what is in such a kit? Kind of the things you would expect. You have your basic first aid medical supplies. I think there was some dehydrated food as well, flashlights, batteries, that sort of stuff. But most notably of all, along with all the stuff in the kit, was a full-size axe. An axe. That was what caught my attention, so I asked him, what is the axe for? And he explained, as he had read and researched, that when the earthquake comes, your building is probably going to be fine. After all, the buildings are built to code and whatnot. It's not going to come crumbling down. But it is going to shift a little bit. And it only takes a little bit of movement for a door to end up getting stuck in the door frame. And if the door is stuck, well then, you are stuck. And if there's just been an earthquake, it's going to be a while before the fire department gets to you. So, hence, the axe. The thing about keeping a full-size axe by your bedroom door is, it seems utterly ridiculous and unnecessary until it isn't. 4 years in Los Angeles, and fortunately, he never had to use that axe. 4 years in Los Angeles, and I never bought one. But I did spend 4 years thinking, well, maybe I should. We are 3 weeks away from the end of Genesis. Joseph has been sold into slavery by his brothers, and at the start of this week's parashah, we find him rotting in an Egyptian prison. By luck, Pharaoh hears that this man can interpret dreams, and he calls on Joseph to help with a particularly difficult, perplexing pair that he had recently had. You know these dreams: the fat cows, the thin cows, the healthy stalks of grain, the diseased ones. And you know how the story goes. Joseph understands the dream means that there are about to be 7 great years. But there's a catch. After those 7 great years are going to be 7 really bad ones. Before I talk about Joseph, just a quick word about Pharaoh. You would think that a God-ordained ruler might be a tad self-absorbed, that maybe a Pharaoh would be wanting to know what these dreams had to say about him. But he hears that the interpretation turns out to have nothing to do with him at all. Sure, 7 years of famine, that would be hard for anyone, but Pharaoh was not going to starve. But yet he doesn't move on to another interpreter. He listens and he acts. It's possible he was kept up at night wondering about these dreams because he thought understanding them could help him. It could help him help others. The story is not really about Pharaoh, but it's worth pointing out he's a pretty benevolent dictator, at least in this instance. Back to Joseph. As you know, he offers the plan that they save the extra grain for the 7 good years so that they'll be able to ride out the 7 bad ones. It's a great idea, and it works out perfectly. But only in hindsight. Consider what that must have been like while it was actually happening. Farming is tough work in the best of circumstances. There is reason that throughout history, whenever farmers had the chance to be not farmers, they have chosen not farmer. Farming is an act of faith. It involves working tirelessly to plant and to tend a crop with no guarantee of the outcome because so much is out of your control. But here we are in Egypt, the best crop anyone has ever seen in a lifetime. And then here comes Joseph with his plan. Let's consider an analogy. Imagine here in Memphis, a leading seismologist warns that we are at risk for a major earthquake. Silly, you say? In 1865, we had one estimated at 5.0 on the Richter scale. It was enough to drop chimneys throughout the city. But back to today in this imagined example, the prediction is coming. And the solution, again in my made-up thought experiment, is retrofitting the city, paid for, again made up, a special tax, let's say 20%. Incidentally, the commentator Rashbam actually calculates that 20% was the amount taken from Egyptian farmers to cover and prepare for the famine. But in our example, a person you don't know, based on research you can't understand, is telling you to prepare for an event that you have never experienced. How would that go over? And if you're sitting there thinking, I would gladly give my money to this person, that's great. But how about your neighbor? Now, play this out for 7 years. 7 years of 20% taxes, 7 years of nonstop construction that leaves nothing looking any different than before, 7 years of the earth solid as ever beneath your feet. If you can imagine a world where that could happen, you're more imaginative than me. I don't think it could happen. But Joseph's constituency was a little different. As long as Pharaoh supported him, the project continued. The Egyptians surely resented this as much as we would. But unlike us, they had no choice. Pharaoh was not up for re-election. Imagine what it would feel like, though, if you were Joseph, knowing you were hated by virtually everyone. Imagine if you were him, wondering if someone would try to hurt you, wondering if you can keep this going for another 6 years, 5 years. Worst yet, wondering if you do manage to pull this off for the time that it takes, what will happen when those 7 years are up? Did you really make the right interpretation of that dream? In all the years of reading this story, this is the first I've seen it through the lens of disaster preparedness. So let's consider what we can learn from this tale. Sometimes we need to be more like Joseph. Leadership takes courage. It also takes an attribute that Joseph was famous for. It takes confidence. Think about it. He made it through 7 years of everyone doubting him, and yet he never changed his mind. That's an extreme example, but there is a guiding principle. If in your heart of hearts you know you're right, you just might be, even if most everyone thinks that you're wrong. And as Joseph understood, sometimes we need to be willing to sacrifice a bit of what we have today to protect ourselves for tomorrow. Sometimes we need to be more like Joseph, but sometimes we need to be willing to listen to the Josephs that we have today. There's no Pharaoh to force us to comply, and I think that overall that's probably a good thing. However, that does put the responsibility to make these decisions on us. We know what happens when we don't listen. We have been warned for years, decades, that something like this, like what we are experiencing now with COVID, was likely to happen. We were warned that we needed to be prepared. And what did we do? It doesn't seem like we listened. And what has been the outcome? We have a shortage of ICU capacity and ventilators. We had not even the slightest inkling of a plan of how to educate our children remotely. And let us not for a moment think that we have overcome these challenges. California has the third highest number of COVID cases not in the country, but in the world. Today, the available ICU capacity in Southern California stands at 0%. 0% availability today. And another national example, the Houston Public School District reports 40% of their students are failing, not just one class, but two. Some of those are failing more. We did not work out the kinks back in the spring. We just got tired about hearing about them. But we tell ourselves, we'll be ready for the next virus. And there is probably some truth in that. We will support stockpiling of medical supplies. We would probably support a strategic toilet paper reserve at this point. But what about not just the next virus, but the next earthquake, the next flood, or yes, even the next famine? The idea that each generation has to personally experience every form of human misery before committing to prepare for them it's not good. There's some solace in knowing we are not the first to be unprepared. Pharaoh might have been a good ruler, but the story makes clear he had absolutely no plan for feeding his people before he had the set of dreams and before he had Joseph to interpret them. Nobody wants to be the one to stand up and say, things are about to get really bad. That will never be a popular message. There is nothing to be gained personally by saying it. So let us learn from this story that we need the courage to say it sometimes, even if we are the only one. And most of all, let us be willing to listen when others raise the alarm. Ken Yehi Ratzon. May it be God's will. Shabbat Shalom.